All right, we are coming at you with part 3, talking about guitars. We're going to talk about the low end, talking about bass guitar.
My voice doesn't get very low. Yours does.
And I'm going to kick it off with a topic that's near and dear to my heart: is how many strings does my bass guitar need? We talked about in our in-ear setup how people thought getting in-ears made them look more professional. We talked about in drum sets how people think using an acoustic drum set makes them more professional. And I have talked to these churchy bass players who think that having a 5 or 6 string bass guitar makes them look more professional. And I kind of giggle. I actually know quite a few professional bass players, guys who are on tour with real bands. Mm-hmm. The most common bass guitar by far across the entire world is a 4-string bass guitar.
Yeah.
By far.
Like a P bass or a jazz bass.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's just hilarious to me that somehow this rumor got perpetuated that the more strings on your bass, the better bass player you are. Really good bass players, and I don't group myself in with the professionals, but I'm a pretty good bass player. You're a pretty good bass player. We know that we choose the bass we're going to use for the specific scenario. Mm-hmm. So I was doing a lot of Broadway style shows. I wasn't playing on Broadway, but I was doing Broadway style shows in college and community theater. And in a lot of times, that book actually called for 3 or 4 bass guitars throughout the entire show. And specifically, there would be parts that were written for a 5-string bass. The notes needed to be there. I needed the low notes.
Sure.
But on the other sections of the book where you don't need the low notes, it's much preferable to play a 4-string bass. If you're just starting out, a 4-string bass is going to be way easier to learn on, much easier to play. So that's my thing. I think everybody should be playing 4-string basses unless the bass player has a good reason he or she's using a 5-string bass. There's a purpose to it.
Yeah, and again, along with acoustic guitars and electric guitars, there's some incredible bass guitars for not much money.
Absolutely.
To name drop something.
Yeah. Well, you just discovered this one, right?
Yeah. So my main bass, I got 2 basses. One's a fretless, which I made it fretless. It didn't come fretless. I've gutted the whole thing. I've put different pickups in. I've done all new hardware. I've done everything new. And I do it mainly for tracking because I like to track some bass guitar. But my main bass is just I could not afford a Pino Palladino Fender P bass for $5,000.
Yeah.
That's kind of the bass that I want. But I could afford a $500 Sire P bass.
Okay, so Sire is the company.
Sire is the company, S-I-R-E.
Okay.
And they make a bunch of stuff. It's like a $500 bass.
Yeah.
And it sounds so good.
Yeah.
It plays fantastic. It sounds fantastic. It is one of the better basses I've ever played.
That's awesome.
And they're 5 something.
Well, and pretty much every company now, Fender and Music Man and all of those, like big names that you've heard of for decades, build, I don't know what you'd call it, like their entry level line. And I'm not talking about going all the way down to, like Squier, although I've played some Squier basses at gigs that were just fine.
That fretless started its life as a Squier.
But a lot of them, like we talk about Mexican-made Fenders, Mexican-made P basses, jazz basses are great. In fact, I know the bass player who plays for
Big Daddy Weave.
One of his go-to basses is a Mexican P bass.
Yeah.
And he's played $3,000-$4,000 basses, and he's like, I love this bass.
The difference here is he's a real bass.
He's really good. It can never be overstated, and all instruments.
Yes.
It does not matter what's in your hand if you don't know how to play it.
Yes, exactly.
But if you do know how to play it, whether it's a P bass or a jazz bass or humbucker, like a Music Man Stingray, that's all flavor.
Yes.
All of those basses can be used in worship. They can all sound great in worship. It's that's more of a personal style. I know some churches supply the bass guitar because they're particular about how they want it to sound. Sure. So like one church I know about supplies an American Pro, so it's really nice, P bass, and that's it. All their bass players have to use the American Pro P bass, and it's fine. I think if you're going to do that, give them a really great bass, and sure, I wouldn't mind showing up to a church that just hands me a bass and says you have to play this. But that's their music director had designed a sound around the P bass they wanted. I personally play a jazz bass, and I grew up playing a lot of jazz, so maybe that's why it's so close to my heart. But I kind of like the bitiness of a jazz bass. I like that it's a little scooped in the mids. Sure. But I mix at a church where the guy plays a 5-string Music Man Stingray, and it sounds so good. And he's a real bass player. He's really good. So like all things, it comes down to that basic stuff. And of course, everything we said about guitars applies. Keep it humidified, change your strings regularly, professionally get it set up at least once a year. And my last thing I'm going to say about basses is, bass players, I know you feel left out. I know you look over at your lead electric guitar player and he's got 20 pedals on his board and you feel left out. Get over it.
And you should be.
Get over it. Sorry, my biggest pet peeve is walking into these churches and the bass player's got a pedal board as big as the lead guitarist.
Well, when we do optimizations,
we end up turning most of that stuff off.
Most of the time, like, I'm not getting a good sound of the bass. Yeah. Hang on a second. Yeah. And I unplug out of the board and I plug directly into the DI. And it sounds like it should.
Yeah. My favorite is a bass running straight into a very basic DI, or an active DI always sounds nice. Or there's a couple companies, there's SansAmp makes a really nice DI that's got a little bit of like preamplification.
Sure.
Ampeg, which is a huge name, they've got they're like $200-$300 pedals. Mm-hmm. They act as DIs, but they do have some amp modeling in them. I'm cool with that. And if you're going to add effects, it's the same thing about playing a 5-string. Do it because you have an intention. You have a reason to do it. You're not just doing it so you have as many pedals.